If you plan to develop your career, especially within corporates, within large organizations, you most likely are going to meet some organizational politics. And in this video, I would like to talk about some ways how people respond when some organizational politics occur. And I think, at least from my perspective, especially the defensive behaviors, is a pretty interesting topic, as you will really find it quite often. So, if you think of it, employees or lower level managers, of course, may not be happy from organizational politics. Only when you really understand if you really understand, it's called a house, if you really understand all the hows and whys, then you might be comfortable. If you really understand how things happen and why do they happen, then you can be okay with organizational politics. But if you do not really have the overview of these, then most likely you are going to have some negative reactions. So, as we have said, organizational politics may threaten employees, and there are four basic reactions to it. First, decreased job satisfaction. So that of course you will be less satisfied because you have not expected that the organizational politics is going to influence your job this much. Secondly, there can be increased anxiety and stress because simply organizational politics, that's one more thing you have to care about, and that creates the stress. Then you have increased turnover of employees, so that the ones that are not happy with organizational politics will simply leave. And finally, and that is the worst case scenario, you have reduced performance. When the organizational politics is influencing people's jobs, and so that they will not have as high performance as they would if the organizational politics did not occur. But most interestingly, let's think about some defensive behaviors that people can have. And I have made quite a long list because I find it very interesting, so we can read through it. So, the defensive behaviors of people when it comes to organizational politics. They can try to avoid the action, that's what we have the first. Then they can try to avoid the blame, especially if something bad happens. And finally, we can try to avoid change. That's the third case. Now, avoiding action, the first reaction can be over-conforming, which would be strictly interpreting your responsibility by saying things like, the rules clearly state. So you are really interpreting your responsibility very, very strictly, and this way you are trying to avoid the action. So that someone asks you, hey, can you please make me a coffee? No, I cannot. That's not my job. The rules clearly state that I should not be making a coffee for you. Secondly, we have backpassing. This is transferring responsibility for the execution of a task to someone else. So that, let's say, your manager asks you to make coffee for him or her, and you will pass it to your personal assistant. That would be the backpassing. Then you have playing dumb. That's a really interesting one, and I personally have sometimes met this. Avoiding an unwanted task by falsely pleading ignorance or inability. So you simply do not want to do something. Let's say you are asked to write a report, and you say, well, I cannot do that, no one taught me, so I'm unable to do that, and so you are playing dumb. Then you have stretching. This is prolonging a task so that one person appears to be occupied. This is especially danger in corporates when it is not always possible to control how long does it take for an employee to complete the task. And so sometimes they can really stretch the task that should be done in 2 weeks into 4 months. Then we have stalling. This is appearing to be more or less supportive publicly while doing little or nothing privately. So showing being supportive publicly, but in reality, when it comes to the privacy, you really do nothing. Then we have avoiding blame. The first reaction is buffing. This is a nice way to refer to covering your rear. It describes the practice of rigorously documenting activities. So that you are doing some, let's say, a project, rigorously documenting a project. And in a case that something bad happens, you are really documenting the project, all the activities rigorously so that you can then avoid the blame if something happens. Then you have playing safe. This is probably the most serious ones, and as it happens the most often. This is avoiding situations that may reflect unfavorably, so that you will go only for some low risk projects. Low risk projects, and generally you will try to avoid the risk taking. Then we have justifying, developing explanations that lessen one's responsibility for negative outcomes. So that you will not, if you are given some project, you will not be working on the project itself, you will be working on the explanations and justifications in case something happens. And that's quite interesting, at least from my perspective. Then we have scapegoating. That's a weird term, but it's placing the blame for a negative outcome on external factors that are not entirely blameworthy. So let's say you are working for a construction company and things do not work out very well for you, and so you will try to avoid the blame by saying that, well, the weather was very bad in recent months, so we couldn't finish the job. However, it does not really, you cannot entirely blame only the weather conditions. As third, and let me just move my screen, we have prevention. That is the part of avoiding change, and that is quite typical. Trying to prevent a threatening change from occurring. So that, for instance, you can use you are asked to contribute to some change and you should perform some action, but you are trying to avoid the change, so you will also try to avoid your part, your action. So you will be stretching it and trying to prevent the change from happening. Finally, there is a self-protection, acting in ways to protect one's self-interest by guarding information or other resources. So that, for instance, you are asked to consult for some organizational change that is going to happen, and you have some very valuable information, but you will guard them and you will not be willing to share them in order to avoid the change.